Welcome to IFERP, a forum where innovations and research interest could be supported and developed, prioritizing our mutual interest. In this video, we want you to dive into our world, giving yourself a clear insight into IFERP. But first, who are we and what do we do? Institute for Engineering Research and Publication, IFERP for short, is one of the world's largest non-profitable professional associations operating under the Techno-Elite Research and Development Association, TRADA, meant for research and development in the field of engineering, science and technology. We are one of the largest professional bodies for engineering professionals in India and across the globe, established in 2014. We extend to every part of the globe, with more than 28,000 professional members and 34,000 student members. Our growing membership at IFERP has led to an increase in members from Europe, Asia, Australia, Africa and the USA, fostering networking opportunities that strengthen ties within and across countries and technical communities. The mission of IFERP is to connect professionals at an integrated platform for growth to divert knowledge and skills towards the sustainable application of professional education and more.
34,000 student members.
Our vision of digitalising innovation processes through our professional networking services and more has pushed us forward to our achievements today. With our mission to make our academic services reach the top and grassroots level of institutions, we are funding colleges to organise conferences and scientific events, enabling researchers incubated at different areas of our country to directly contribute towards the transformation of India. IFERP simply connects engineers, exchange global innovation, and acts as a bridge between researchers and academics by organising international conferences, world conferences, faculty development programs, webinars, seminars, providing membership, and more. Some of our conferences include WCASET Malaysia, WCASET Jakarta, ICAS ETAM APU Malaysia, and many more. We've also organised scientific events in association with renowned universities done in the past, with over 28,593 journal publication services, creating opportunities to get your research paper published in high impact factor journals such as Scopus Indexed, Web of Science, Google Scholar Index journals, ESCI, UGC approved, L Compandax, ISI, Chimago Index journals, and many more. To make our operations smoother and more perfect, we have been supported by our associated organisation, Association of Cloud Technologists, Global Association of Nanotechnology, International Association for Big Data Analysts, International Association for IoT, International Wireless Network Association, and World Association for Structural Engineers. We have also worked alongside several clients and partners both nationally and internationally like University Malaysia Sabah, APU Malaysia, UNJ Jakarta, MC University Thailand, Ajman University Dubai, PUP Philippines, IIUM Malaysia, ISU Philippines, FCPC Philippines, WCC Philippines SRM University, Galgotia University, Amity University, and much more government and private organisations in different countries. At IFERP, we believe that there's always a better way to treat professionals, and that is what we do. If you would like to see more or go deeper on IFERP, you can visit our website at www.iferp.in.
Hello everyone, good evening. Good evening to our webinar series on PhD end-to-end assistance and guidance. And today we are moving on to session 3, and today we are being joined by Dr. Supriya ma'am. Ma'am, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Hello ma'am, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Ma'am, I guess your video is off.
You want me to turn that on as well?
Yeah, you can enable it.
Uh-oh. There's a video. Yes.
Yes. Hello, ma'am.
Hello.
Thank you for joining today.
That's fine.
And hello all attendees who are watching us from YouTube as well as who has joined us today live on the webinar. So today we are moving on to session 3, where we'll be discussing on creating a structure for your literature review and incorporating the previous research. And before we begin, I would like to introduce and welcome our speaker of the day, Dr. Supriya ma'am. Dr. Supriya Patnaik, she has more than 25 years of experience in the development sector and academia. She has earned a reputation of being a highly competent professional working with bilateral, multilateral government and non-government organizations. She has demonstrated excellent relationship management, management skills with multiple stakeholders for policy advocacy and good program management skills. She has specifically provided advisory support in all programs on social development and government aspects. She has maintained oversight of all DFID programs in the state of Odisha over the past 15 years, and she has taken on increasingly challenging roles in planning, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating large programs with a focus on results. In addition to this, Dr. Supriya ma'am, she maintains her interest in academics, being involved in teaching, training, supervision, research, and conducting study tours across several continents. Presently, she is Vice Chancellor at the Centurion University of Technology and Management, Odisha, India. She also holds the position of an industry licensed person with RMIT University, Melbourne, Australia, and is a research fellow at the St. Petersburg State University at Russia. And she has a number of publications to her credit. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us today. It's really an honor to have you here today evening.
Thank you to you, Jazila, and thank you to IFERP for inviting me to this session. I look forward to having this interaction with the students.
Sure. I'm very sure that the participants are eagerly looking forward to your presentation. So without any delay, we'll first move on to our presentations, ma'am.
Yes, sure. So I can just share my slide, right?
Yes, ma'am. We have uploaded it here. Sure.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. You may begin.
You can see it, right?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay. So welcome all of you. I'm actually, I have a lot of slides in this, but really I would like to speak a few words prior to that. Towards the end, about 15 slides are just illustrations of various aspects of literature review. So you can, if we don't cover that, you can just take a look at some of these aspects. But I would just like to, first of all, as we go, dwell on the first about 5 slides a little more in detail, although on the slides it's very sketchy, but I will talk to them much more. So let's move on. You all have had the first 2 sessions already on research, so you already know what research is all about. And but I just thought that I would kind of state upfront what it looks like to me and what I think that candidates should actually take home from this session. And it's like, essentially, research is like the 7 blind men who felt the elephant from different spaces and then looked at it as depending on where they were feeling the elephant, they looked at it in different ways. So the person who was looking at his leg said it was a tree, and someone who touched his trunk said it was a snake. So that was the kind of thing. So that's how most often research is all like, it's all about. And essentially, it is about from which space do you look at the research you're conducting. So it is about what is your position or your location when you're conducting a research, and what is your standpoint when you're conducting a research. That will make that will make your research take a certain turn. Now, let me at the outset point out that I am not an engineer, so I will be mostly speaking from the perspective of a social scientist, but I can tell you that there are a lot of the learning that you have in this which will transcend all disciplines. So that's why I'm just, like I said, I will speak to some of these much more than anything else. So I think this is the main aspect of research that we all need to bear in mind, and that therefore it's very important that upfront we know and we state where we are coming from, so that the audience or the reader of that research is able to look at it from this very same lens that you are looking at, so that there is no misunderstanding in what it is that you are trying to convey and what it is that the person who's the audience is actually reading or listening. I think that is one important takeaway that I also had initially as an early career researcher, that is very important to state it upfront. Now, I think if you look at, and some of this you would have already covered in the last two sessions, but I'm just trying to take you through just a few things, because I think these are some things that we take for granted. And so I thought that I would just highlight some of these things. So when you look at the steps in the research process, and I deliberately call this an academic version, because this is what your research apparently ultimately looks like. And it's not necessary that it should follow the same order or the same way, but it's more or less something like this. And there might be small variations to this, but it is more or less like this. And as if, research is a very neat process, and that you go from one step to the other. Okay, you can say, I finished this, let me put this aside, let me move it on. The one thing I want to point out, and I'm telling all my students as well, is that especially the aspect that we are discussing today of literature review, it begins even before you start your PhD thesis, when you're trying to determine what you would like to research for your PhD or for any kind of research. And it continues until you complete your thesis, or even till the day you hand it over. Because one of the things is about research and about literature review is that you don't want it to be dated. That's one thing. But you also want to tell the audience that, look, I have got a certain expertise in this field by virtue of doing this research. So I'm very, very up to date on what kind of research is being undertaken in this field, in this discipline. So therefore, we have literature review which continues throughout. You may kind of put it aside for a while, but you always keep coming back to it, because all these steps in some ways are it's an iterative process. So you have to keep going back, looking at your research, looking at your literature, looking at what the literature suggests, and then accordingly you are planning out your research. So therefore, it's a very important thing to know that while this is an academic version, in real life it looks more like this. It's a much more messier affair, as you can see, and most often you can either call it action in the world, or research that is already being undertaken in the world, or some kind of finding, or some kind of the reality out there, whatever you want to call it. That is what you're trying to study. And so you have problems, issues, and questions that may arise at various stages. Then you may have field research, and you have the analysis. It's not as if field research leads to analysis and reflection, but straight from the questions, you have analysis and reflection. So it's a much messier affair than we imagine it to be. I think that's what is an important thing to realize, that, if you are finding that, oh my God, it's so confusing, or it's so difficult, you're not alone in it. Everybody goes through that phase. And for everybody, it's a very, very messy kind of an affair. And I'm not saying confusing, I would rather call it messy. Research is a bit of a messy process. It's in your mind that you have to get a lot of clarity around these things and actually reviewing the literature and organizing the literature helps you get some of that clarity. So just to kind of highlight to you that everybody goes through this process, and therefore one of the biggest things we have found in PhD research, and there's a lot of literature which suggests this, that it's very important to have peer contact, peer engagement. You find other scholars who are working on these areas, and you discuss with them, and that is what actually works for you and for them. So because research is actually a very lonely journey, as I say, and it's your learning really. So you need to have that kind of engagement which will help you actually then work together, work through your issues and gain more clarity. Now, this again, I kind of emphasize this for two reasons, and you call it a top-down approach, if you may like, or you can also call it an either or reductionist approach. I would rather call it that, but you can call it a top-down analysis. And so the approach to research is generally twofold, which is either a top-down approach, which is understanding the more general aspects of it, of a particular theme or a particular research area or a particular discipline, to understand all the comprehensive factors, and then seek to kind of come down to the understanding of the specific issue that you're actually researching. So that is what is it's a very top-down kind of approach, which is when you talk about having a hypothesis, you are taking a bit of a very top-down approach because you already have decided on a particular theoretical framework, and then you kind of embed what you're trying to research within that framework, and then try and understand whether what it is that you are trying to study is actually fits into that or aligns itself to that theoretical approach. So that is a very top-down approach. On the other hand, you have a bottom-up approach, which takes a completely different kind of a route, and it is generally looking at the specific, and from that arriving at the more general. And this is the more kind of exploratory kind of research which happens, or the grounded research that happens, where you actually go and say, I am going to find out what is happening out there. What is the reality out there? I am not going in with any ideas in my mind about what kind of theoretical framework it is falling into, but on the basis of what my findings out are, I will try and theorize on the basis of that. So these are the two kinds of approaches mainly that research follows. Now, within this, if you look at it, the top-down approach more mainly follows a kind of a, and I don't like to make these binary oppositions and say the Western and the other, but it's an either or kind of a reductionist approach. So it is either this or that, so there cannot be any shades of gray, or there's no third way. And the bottom up is more of a both and kind of approach, which is, it is this and this and this. So in countries like mine, in India, for example, it's very important, and most of us look at it in terms of a very both and kind of an approach, because we are highly diverse. So if we have to we cannot have these kind of either or approaches, because we have so many multiple kind of views, and we have, and they're all in some ways they're all legitimate. Let me put it that way. So therefore, we have a much more both and kind of an approach. For example, recently I was at a webinar and I was saying that there is this concept called, and I just heard it recently because it was about management, and I'm not from the field of management, but you have something which is called this VUCA, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And there was somebody else who has suggested an alternate to that, which is slightly different. And I keep on thinking that why is it that it has to be posed as an alternate, and why is it that it cannot be, for example, volatility and vision, uncertainty and understanding? Why does it have to be or understanding? Why does it have to be volatility and or vision? So this is the kind of approach that we need to understand. Where is it that we come from? Again, this comes back to our understanding of what is our standpoint, what is our position, what is our location, where is it that we come from. That is extremely important when we are doing any research, but also in terms of how do we approach literature. How do we approach literature? And I think that's why I'm going into this, although you may have already looked at it. I have decided that I would go through this again so that you understand that it directly links to the way you approach literature. Now, here is just a bit of a write-up about positioning and standpoint in research. And one of the things is a lot of this theorizing around positioning and standpoint came out of feminist philosophies. Some of the feminist philosophers who worked around this area actually talked about it, because they said that basically a lot of dominant knowledge practices disadvantage women. And how do they disadvantage them? And we see it happening even today. Even today, we see this happening in a lot of research. Either they are excluded from inquiry, or they are subsumed within different categories. So it's as if their voices are not heard, right? So, and thereby you're denying them the authority in knowledge creation. It's as if they cannot contribute to knowledge creation, or they're not able to create knowledge, or they have no knowledge. So all these kinds of views are there, and denigrating feminine cognitive styles. That do they think differently? Why is it? Oh, they go on in circles. So it's that kind of thing. You denigrate that feminine cognitive styles, and then producing theories of women that represent them as inferior. This happens a lot of the time. There's a lot of writing out there which highlights this, or significant only in ways that serve male interests, and producing theories of social phenomena that render women's activities and interests or gendered power relations invisible, and producing knowledge that is not useful for people in subordinate positions, or that reinforces gender and other social hierarchies. So you can see, while the feminist philosophers looked at the whole issue and identity of women and their position in knowledge creation, but this actually applies to a lot of other people within social hierarchies. So if you see, the same thing can be said about other marginalized groups, for example, indigenous people, for example, the disabled. So a lot of the marginalized groups, transgendered, people with HIV and AIDS. So there are all kinds of issues that you can see with all different social categories. They are all marginalized in similar manners. Situated knowledge is knowledge that reflects the particular perspectives of the knower. So here what you're trying to say is the person who comes in, who is a participant in your research, is a knowledgeable person, is the knower, and you are actually reflecting their perspectives. You are allowing their voices to be heard. Their voices are actually given the space and they are heard. This is what was where it all came from, with lot of the feminist literature, and there was a lot of interest, and therefore around the 80s and 90s there was a whole plethora of literature which came out on a lot of research which was conducted on women, and a whole lot of literature that subsequently came out, because the standpoint became very, very clear, and it was important for people to actually recognize, acknowledge, and then research particular groups and have their voices heard. So you can see that it's so important especially in countries and communities where there is huge amount of diversity. So that's where it becomes very important to have to be sure and certain about where is it that you as a researcher come from. So I want to give you some of these quotes because I think that these are really very, very important. So some of this is for you to take home to use as you wish, but this is something which is very interesting. And if you can see, 2016, Makuvira posits, development has by and large been a study of the other, the study of the South by the North, of the village by the city, leading to dominant perceptions that problems are of the South and solutions the domain of the North. So I think this is what again is a kind of a reductionist position of the North as being the all-knowing, the majority world, the South, as being deficient in some ways, and therefore we know the solution. You have all the problems, we know the solution. So it was always that development studies came from that perspective. And therefore now, rather for almost a decade now, we've been having a whole lot of theorists, practitioners who are talking about a post-development era of decolonization and such other aspects. The greatest impediments to decolonization are the very people who are supposed to lead the decolonial struggle because they are products of colonization. So I kind of keep on saying this about myself, and I'm very watchful of the research I do and very watchful of the manner in which I write so that I do not fall into this trap myself. We are all a part of this, we all fall into this trap, and therefore we need to recognize this at all times. We need to unlearn things we have learned, we need to relearn things again. Only then can we liberate ourselves and and everybody else. So they will need to first liberate themselves before they can do anything. It becomes a lifelong relearning process. And the leading academic voices on decolonization are also products of westernized universities, which taught them to think in a particular way, and the potential for contradictions and ambivalences are endemic to the exercise, and we must not fear confronting them. So the whole idea here is to actually acknowledge that, confront it for ourselves. Look, this is what is happening. I know, I have been trained by that very same system, which is making me think in a particular way, is making me write in a particular way. It is making me conduct research in a particular way. It is making me approach literature in a particular way. So all this becomes absolutely imminent for us as early career researchers to take note of. Then to go a little further, so what should a complete standpoint theory must specify? It should specify the social location of the advantaged perspective and its scope, the aspect of the social location that generates epistemic advantage. For example, so one thing you need to do is say, what is the location of the advantaged perspective? So if you're doing some kind of research, who in that is advantaged? Am I, as the researcher, am I coming from an advantageous position? So then the lens through which I'm looking at the reality is from that advantageous position. So if you say it up front, then you are likely to not just acknowledge it in everything, but also enable the reader to actually recognize that what is your location within this research. Then what is the scope, the subject matters over which it claims advantage. So where is it that you think that you have the advantage when you come into a certain kind of a research and knowledge creation. Then the aspect of the social location that generates that advantage that knowledge has. For example, is it social role or your subjective identity? What is it? What is it that gives you that advantage? What is it that gives you that advantage of that so-called epistemic their knowledge that you have? So you might say that I have been trained from some of the most apex institutions, so I think that I'm advantaged because of that. I am from a well-to-do family, and if I'm going to go and study a village, or I'm going to study issues of poverty, or issues of livelihoods, or issues of natural resource management, then I am already, in some ways, I am advantaged. In many ways, I am advantaged. Then what are the grounds of this advantage? What justifies its claim to superiority? So that is the other thing. So you have to actually then say that why do you think that this advantage is or is considered superior? And I think that's some of this again comes down to what we have discussed before in terms of the North and the South. These kind of ideas are coming from that, because there's always a notion of superiority when it comes to talking from the North when compared to those in the South. We have the answers, we have the solutions, you have the problems. You have the questions, we have the solutions. So this is the kind of thing which has happened. Then the type of epistemic superiority it claims, for example, greater accuracy or greater ability to represent fundamental truths. Again, this question, this keeps coming up all the time, and to me, this is always a matter of big concern. That and this was again something that the feminists came up with, saying that is there the only one truth, or are there multiple truths? So there are many truths, and so we need to understand that. So a lot of the feminist research which came out of the third world was actually highlighting the fact that there is not a fundamental truth, and there are many truths. Then that's what we are trying to explore. Then the other perspectives relative to which it claims advantage. So there are many other perspectives that by virtue of which it claims advantage, you claim advantage. Then modes of access to that perspective is occupying the social location necessary or sufficient for getting access to the perspective. And I think this is what is important, that you state up front that because of your location, or because of your positionality or your positioning, or because of your standpoint, are you getting a greater access to a certain perspective, right? So you say that, if you say, for example, if I said that I have been to some of the apex institutions in India, I have then had an education from different parts of the world. Yes, I have access to certain perspectives which a number of people who have come out from a particular level may not have had, level of institutions. They may not have had, or they may not have access to. So this is one of the things that we need to constantly bear in mind, that positioning and standpoint in research is reflected in the way we design the project, in the way we conceive, the way we conceptualize the research, the way we go about literature review. Everything is clearly influenced by our standpoint, by our position, by our location. So we need to be very careful how we position ourselves, and how is it that we are trying to address the advantage that comes with that location and position. I think that is what we need to be very clear about. So then, what is a literature review? And I think some of this, or most of you would know, it's not such great rocket science. So we'll just go through some of this as quickly as possible, and we'll actually come to some of the major issues. So literature review is an account of what has been published on a topic by accredited scholars and researchers. We know, so you actually go to all the publications that have been done, that have been that have been conducted in that discipline or in your area of research. When you compile it, and we'll see how it's going to be done, but it is not just a descriptive material of the descriptive list of the material available or a set of summaries. So we need to know that what is required of a literature review is to actually be critical, is to actually be analytical, and that is what makes a literature review good. So we look at, so what is a critical review then? What is a critical literature review? In order to qualify as a critical review, you must go beyond the simple description of the sources you read. You need to consider what, first, the breadth of different pieces of work, right? So how wide a range of the possible subject matter defined by a question or objectives do different pieces of work cover? So one of the things you're trying to achieve by doing a PhD is to say that you are gaining a certain amount of expertise in a particular field. Now, I don't like the word expert and expertise, but for want of another word, I'm only using it. But you have a certain breadth of knowledge in that discipline, right? So that is what you're trying to achieve through a PhD. So therefore, you have to look at literature very critically from different aspects. One is to look at different pieces of work, how wide range of possible subject matter is being covered. The depth. So how detailed is the analysis of the subject matter in each piece of work? So you should remember that at the end of the day, your literature review is also going to be looked at from these very perspectives. That how wide have you gone? How wide have you looked at the subject? How deep, how much in depth have you gone into the subject? So while you look at the literature out there from that perspective, your literature review will also be looked at from the same perspective when your assessment will happen. Or somebody is trying to look at an article that you may have written. They will be looking at it from the very same perspectives. The third aspect is the relevance. So the relevance of each piece of work to your specific question or objective. So how much of the subject matter you're focusing on do different pieces of work cover? Are subjects missed out in different sources? Are the research methods adopted in one source more useful in answering your questions than those adopted in another? And so on. Now, the interesting thing is that at least I have seen here, now that I'm supervising students, PhD scholars here, I have noticed one thing. They think that a literature review only concerns the subject matter, or whatever you have raised in your the kind of questions you have for your research or your objectives. That's it. But the tradition from which I have come actually says that you have to look at also what is the research around the methodologies that you're going to adopt. So the chapter on methodology also equally has a lot of literature review around the methodologies. But that is something that I don't often see here, which I think is a very important aspect, because then you can also look very critically at some of the methodologies. I'll tell you one real example. One of the problems is about using standardized scales. Now, a lot of people directly adopt standardized scales, and they say, "Oh, yes, we have just we have administered this scale, and these are our results." So there have been times when I've asked, "How did you ask this question?" It's, first of all, did you have it translated into the local language? or did you administer it in English? So if you administered it in English, in which the language of the test is, then how did you actually ask this question? And what kind of response did you get? So these are some of the questions. If you don't ask now, this makes it very problematic, because I think it's important that you actually look at what is the relevance of some of the works that you do, or some of the methods that you use to your questions that you have. So I think we should not just take on something in a rote manner because, okay, yes, it has been standardized, so I'll take it. But actually, whether it is relevant to what you're doing, and whether it actually helps you identify the kind of responses in the context in which it was constructed, the kind of responses it got, whether this context actually enables similar kind of responses, because the contexts are totally different. So I'm always a bit concerned when I see students or candidates, in fact, even at a lower stage like undergraduate and postgraduate, they just kind of, without thinking, they just directly adopt some of these things. So it's important to always look at some of these aspects when you're doing your literature review, to look at also the methodology. Then what are the gaps in the form of relevant questions that do not appear to have been tackled by the authors you read? So I think this is the kind of thing that actually enables you to then finally determine what is the area of research that you yourself want to pursue. Because when you find a gap, that helps you to say, okay, this is the area that has not been researched, and I think that what I research will add value or will make a significant contribution to the field, because I've actually identified what is a gap area and I'm going to research that area. Then look at the research from the point of contradictions and look at the literature from the point of contradictions and inconsistencies, both within single pieces of work and as a result of making comparison between the work of different authors. Now, I have seen that this happens very often, and I think one needs to be careful. Therefore, some of you who are also writing now, you need to be very careful that there should be internal consistency in your in a chapter or in your article that you're writing, that you don't contradict yourself within the same article or the same chapter. So in the literature, you still find things like this, and I will probably have a few examples at the end. So what is the purpose of literature review? And we said the purpose of a literature review was to convey to the reader what knowledge and ideas have been established on a topic and what their strengths and weaknesses are. So that is what you are essentially trying to do, is to review all the literature out there in the area that you are researching or in a particular discipline, and then to actually identify where the strengths and weaknesses are, whether they have kind of addressed the breadth of the issues within the particular topic, whether they have gone into it in depth. That is what is required. So therefore, recently I had an article published, and I sent it to a friend. After it was published, I sent it to a friend, and she said, you could have actually made at least about 6 articles from this. You have put so much of information into one article. You could have easily gone into greater depth and widened the scope of each aspect that you have dealt with in there, and you could have done that. So there is you need to be, therefore, look at material that's written very critically when you are doing the literature review. As a piece of writing, the literature review must be defined by a guiding concept. Example, your research objective, the problem or issue you are discussing, your argumentative thesis, or your epistemology or methodology. Now, let me tell you one rider is that literature review is like any other essay. It is like, so it follows the same rules as any essay, that you have an introduction, you have a body, and you have a conclusion. Now, what does that depend on? It depends, in this instance, your literature review would depend or would center around your research objectives. What is the problem or issue that you are discussing? Or what is your argument in this whole thing? Or your epistemology or methodology. So this is what you are looking at, and oftentimes it is not all these things, it is all of them. So you need to recognize that it is often it is all of these things. Like I said, that you may in your methodology chapter have a lot of review of literature around methodologies itself. In your theoretical framework, you will have a lot of review of literature around the theoretical basis and where does that come from, was that what supports your theorizing around this topic. So all those kinds of things you have to be very careful about. So it is not or any of these, often it is all of them. So you need to be very clear about some of these things. So it may happen that in your final defense or in your annual reviews or somewhere, somebody might challenge you or question you about what is it that your research and literature review is, what does it say about the methodology you've adopted? Now, you may not be, suddenly you may be taken unawares. So it is important that you actually look at all of these aspects, at least to some extent. Some of these things you look at in less depth than others, but mostly you do have to look at all of them. Now, what will be the skills you'll be acquiring through this process? So besides enlarging your knowledge on the topic, writing a literature lets you gain and demonstrate skills in two areas. One of it is how do you seek information? And the second is how do you critically apprise the literature? And that is what is very, very important. So one is the ability to scan the literature efficiently using manual or computerized methods to identify a set of useful articles and books. And now there are increasingly more and more tools to do this. You have the EndNotes, you have Mendeley, you have I don't know how many other tools where you can do this very, very efficiently and effectively. And then the ability to actually apply principles of analysis to identify unbiased and valid studies. So you also have to identify which of the studies, which of the literature is highly quoted. And we do know that there will be some seminal texts which you cannot be researching on some area and not quote them. So those you have to first of all identify, and then you also have to look at that literature which is as unbiased as possible. And this comes down to what I said at the beginning, at the start, where your positionality and all that is clear so that you are unbiased, but also then some of this helps you to look at the literature out there that is unbiased and makes it very, very strong in terms of the outputs. So what must a literature review do? It must be, again, coming back to that, it must be organized around and related directly to the thesis or research questions you're developing. It must synthesize results into a summary of what is and is not known. And so you're identifying thereby the gaps. Then you identify areas of controversy in the literature. And you formulate questions that need further research. So on the basis of this, you actually, on the basis of your literature review, you kind of probably can come down and really focus on what is it that you want to do. So you're at the initial stages when you're writing your proposal. In effect, what you're trying to do is doing a quick scan of the literature to identify what are the gaps. Now, it may so happen that as you start your research, you'll find that some of this work has already been done. So, and this is one thing, like I keep on saying that PhD research is a very iterative process and things keep changing. Because as I said, you may find that what you had proposed at the outset is already quite well researched, but there is another area of gap that you had not, in the first instance, when you did your literature review, you had not identified. So you can always go back and refocus or, kind of realign your proposal to take into account those gap areas which you had not identified in the first place, in the first instance. So this is the kind of thing which happens. I'd like to remind you again and again that it is an iterative process. Quite often, in India, we have, when you submit your application for your PhD, you give a particular topic, and then it becomes a very, very difficult process to change that topic. Whereas I recall I did my my PhD in Australia, and I was actually changing the title till the last minute. So it's a very, very iterative process, and we need to recognize that. And so therefore, in my university, I have been kind of trying to highlight this fact that you should be able to change your topic as and when you find that it requires changing. It should not be that you are it's so cast in stone that you cannot do anything beyond that. So therefore it is important, because when we say that you formulate your questions and where are the gaps, like I said, at the time of the proposal you may have done some amount of work, but as you go further you recognize that there is a lot of literature already in that area. What value am I adding? Whereas here there is a gap area where there isn't much literature, and that is the area that I would like to focus on. So this is some of the things that we need to recognize all the time. We need to identify logical flaws. Now, often there is, in literature, there are sometimes flaws that are there. So you recognize what are the invalid assumptions and arguments that are done. And often there are lots of assumptions we make, and sometimes those assumptions are entirely invalid. So we need to recognize what are the unstated and invalid assumptions. We need to distinguish facts from hypotheses. So again, often there is a confusion when people are in their very early stages of their research. They make these kind of errors, sometimes confusing between what are the facts and what are the hypotheses. You need to distinguish between facts and opinions. Again, this is a very important thing, that especially when you are doing group, say focus group discussions, what is a person stating as a fact, and how are they stating what are they stating as an opinion? I think it's very important to note that also in when you are actually asking questions of people, it is important to recognize that, and distinguish an argument's conclusions from the statements that support it. This again becomes a very, very important aspect, because when you are looking at an article, whether there is this logical flow is what is important. So there is the conclusion to the argument, and what are the whether the statements which are using to support it, whether you are able to distinguish them, or actually the statements which are used to support it actually become the conclusions in themselves. So this is the kind of thing we need to recognize, that should not be the case. What you are concluding on the basis of your study is what you have found, and you might be quoting somebody else's study which is actually supportive of your finding, but still maybe slightly different, and you cannot quote that as a concluding argument of your research. So it's important to distinguish these two. So then you also need to recognize what kind of evidence is relevant and essential for the validation of an argument. So this is again important, because I always think it's very important to understand what constitutes evidence. So you need to understand, first of all, what is evidence? What is evidence? Is it what I have, suppose I do a qualitative study, I interview, say, 10 women, and I have got all this text that I have. Is it evidence or not? Is this evidence or not? So there is a lot of literature which is available regarding this, and we need to understand for ourselves when we are stating, because you could be again challenged about some of that at some stage. So you need to understand what constitutes evidence. And or suppose I am doing an observational study. I'm standing, I've spent about 10 months, which was my research. I spent 10 months in a village just observing and talking to people, just because my study was on everyday life. So I used to just talk to people. I have copious amounts of notes, and I had a lot of observational notes. Now, what constitutes evidence in this? So all these kinds of things we need to be very clear about as we are doing this, and recognize how much evidence is needed to support a conclusion, distinguish between relevant and irrelevant statements and evidence. And this again, we need to identify what of it again is opinions, what of it is actual evidence or fact. And some of these things we need to get to understand very clearly. And where are the logical fallacies? So we need to understand some of these things quite clearly in order to make sure that our literature review is actually able to highlight some of these things in the text that we are reviewing, in the literature that we are reviewing. Are some of these issues a problem? We need to be able to highlight that, and that is what is important. So I said your literature review is not a summary of what you have read. It's not paraphrasing what you have read. It's not directly quoting what you have read. It's actually looking at these aspects through a very critical lens of what you're reading is the literature which is relevant to your topic, which is relevant to your objectives or your research questions. And you're looking at the literature that you have found, you have scanned, and you may have found 100 articles, and you have to look at it from these perspectives to see that, yes, which of them are most relevant to your research, which of them are actually pieces of valid research that you can quote, which of them are things that you would like to follow or emulate in some ways. So all those kinds of things you highlight. So then there is, I'll just go back to a little bit. So we were looking at identifying logical flaws. So what must a literature review do? It must identify logical flaws in the literature that you're reading. It must look at primary sources. What are the logical flaws with primary sources? The suitability of the research design. So whether the research which is being presented, whether the research design that it has followed is suitable for that kind of research or not. That is what we need to look at. Or is the research design flawed? In what way is it flawed? So that is one of the things. Then you look at it in terms of the effectiveness of the data collection process. So a lot of these things we don't bother about, but I thought that these are very small things which often get left out. So I thought I would highlight them here, that you can actually use some of these things when you're doing a literature review to look at and address some of these issues. So the effectiveness of the data collection process, then the validity of the sample selection process. This is one thing that I have constantly I ask candidates, that on what basis have you decided on your sample? How did you decide your sample? On what basis? So the validity of the sample selection process, and then the appropriateness of the chosen research methodology to the subject being researched. Again, this is one thing, like I said, I talked of a qualitative approach. Now, you might say, like suppose now in a lot of fields, there is such an emphasis of doing randomized controlled trials. Now, you can turn around and say that, I do not agree with it. Like, I think that the same information that we are seeking can be got through other means. So we don't need to actually conduct a randomized controlled trial. But again, like I said, that at the outset, that when you have this either or kind of a logic that you're coming into in research, then you say it's randomized controlled trial or nothing. Randomized controlled trials or nothing. So when you start with that kind of an approach, then you get into that. But that's again, like I said, that's a kind of a approach to research and approach to knowledge creation, which has actually, and I am kind of lost for words sometimes, but which actually creates a lot of the problems that arise at a later stage. So we need to understand some of these things. Why should we be a little more open? Why can't we be a little more open? But some of the ways to do it is to be very critical of the literature that is available out there, and see, suppose you find that there is a piece of research which has followed this, you ask questions like, could this have been done better by using a certain other method? So that is how you're being critical. You're being analytical. You're not criticizing it, but you're being analytical, and you're asking the right kind of questions to allow you to come up with with better responses to issues. And this is known, so I think I'll skip this. What are the kinds of sources? We know there are primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. So primary is your data, secondary is articles, books, journals, etc., etc., and tertiary are books and articles based on secondary sources, or or on the research of others. So if you are talking about systematic reviews, which are now available on various subjects, then that would be a tertiary source, because it's like a literature review or existing literature review of literature reviews. So it's a meta-analysis, let's put it that way. So you can have tertiary sources as well. So there are two common problems which are often encountered when we are trying to do a literature review. And the first one is not knowing where to find sources. And this I often find quite experienced people also asking, where do we go? Where do we find this? Where do we start? Where do we start? That's often a issue that is raised. And once the other issue that arises is that once sources are located, not knowing how to sift or sort through an excess of information to determine what is useful to you. So this is a major problem, I think, that all of us have gone through. That we need to recognize. So we are often landed with so much of literature that we are thinking, oh, what do we do now? What do we do? There's so much of information. So one of the now, of course, with a lot of technology and a lot of databases, it is becoming increasingly easy, because you know that if you put where your you can find that what is the biggest similarity index to what it is that you are studying, you will get those articles or those journals or those books first. So you can choose to take the first 20, for example, or first 10 in that area. And then you can put in another subtopic and you can get another 10. So this is, of course, now we have a lot more help than we did before, because when I was doing, I remember I used to always struggle with this. There was so much of information out there. There was so much of data out there. it used to be so difficult to sift and sort through all that. So now it is becoming much, much easier with all the technology and all the kind of resources that are available to us. But these are very common problems which are encountered. So what do? You first of all, in getting started, we actually familiarize ourselves with libraries, reference systems, both print and electronic, maintain a tracking system. So I think one of the key things is actually maintaining a tracking system. Otherwise, what happens is you keep going back and you come back to the same thing over and over again. So if you have not maintained a tracking system to say that, okay, I've looked at this and this is what this says, and then I move on. So that becomes critical. And now again, this is being done. There are a lot of tools now to do this, whereby you can organize your data in such a way that you can actually do mind maps of your literature. So you can say that, okay, my research actually has these 5 thematic areas, and that is essentially my mind map. And in each of those thematic areas, I have about these 50 articles that I've identified. In each of these 50 articles, there are 3 key areas that have come out. So you can actually organize it completely in mind maps. I was surprised the other day. I actually had one of my students make a presentation to his peers that he had used this tool, where he could map his entire literature review like that. So it was so easy then to draw arrow marks and draw connections. It was almost like a network analysis, like a real mind map. You can just do it. There are tools out there where you can do it. Then the other thing you can do is construct a list of experts in your field who can help you in just identifying what might be the gaps. One thing, but also they can tell you where to go. So an interview with an expert can produce valuable insights and possibly save you a lot of time and effort. So you can just ask the expert, saying, okay, what is it that I need to look at? What would you recommend? What would you recommend? Well, so this is one thing which is really very helpful. I mean, often your supervisor is the person who plays that role, but many a times going to experts is also a very good idea. Sometimes your supervisor themselves will tell you, look, there is this person who has done work in this area. I think you should go and consult them. Because it's not necessary that your supervisor knows every aspect of the things that you're doing. Like I was working on India in Australia. So often my supervisor used to tell me that, look, you need to identify the experts in your field back home who can help you in responding to some of these questions. While I can assist you in a lot of things, there are things that you need to also seek responses from people who understand some of these things. So you can contact experts by emails, and an important question to ask maybe, if I were to pick up where you or your student left off, what advice would you give? So I'm just trying to ask you that, okay, I saw your work. I've seen that you have done this. I know that some of your students have done this, or I don't know what your students have done. So can you tell me that where would you now start if you had to take up this subject? Where would you start? Where would you want me to start? So that is one of the ways that you can actually resolve some of these issues and get some more clarity. Because otherwise you can be lost in all that. Like I said, sifting and sorting through a lot of literature might be very difficult. So this is some ways of kind of drawing boundaries around what it is that you need to take up, so that you're not just you're not just one of those blind people who are going and touching the elephant somewhere. So you are actually going about it in a very concerted manner to address what is it that I want to do, what is it that I need to do, and who can help me. do this. So that is what you are trying to achieve through this. Then you have a search plan. So you get started, you contact experts, you contact people in the respective fields. Then you also have a search plan where you consider how a topic progresses through a research documentation life cycle. So this is again one of the things which are which you do in a literature review is when you organize your literature review. There are different ways you can organize it. You can either organize it chronologically, depending on what it is that you're doing, or you can organize it thematically. So I think these are clearly the ways that you're doing. So one thing to do is actually look at the literature that you're finding from that perspective or from that point of view. So you actually, when you're trying to look for it, you start saying that, okay, I'm going to limit myself. I'm going to look at this not beyond 10 years, because it is not going to be very useful to go way back. So often you just have to put a limit. So in the 10 years, then you start looking at it systematically, year by year. What is the kind of changes, or what is the kind of research that has been done over a period of the last decade? Now you can also do it thematically, as I suggested, that you identify particular themes and say that these are the themes that I am working on as part of my research, and I'm going to do a literature survey around these themes. And while I do it around those themes, I am also going to limit it to a decade. So you can do both of them. So that's one of the things you need to do. Then it is also important to look at the citations. So suppose, and this is one thing that I thought it's a very organic thing, but I find a lot of students who don't do it. That is that when you read an article, to look at the references, the citations, and then go and look at some of those citations in turn, because that is what will help you actually build your argument. Because what a particular author may have, particular author's reading of that article might be quite different from what you get out of it. So often it is good to look at citations from of one author, look at that and then collect accordingly. And like I said, develop a tree-like diagram or network showing not only relevant research, but possibly even how the works of others are interrelated. So as I told you, you can draw arrow marks to show how it is linked or how you would want to link them. So that also is there. You can do all that when you start doing the arrangement of the literature into a kind of network-like diagram. Then reading abstracts can help you categorize papers by topics and by authors' technical interests. Quite often, your choice of articles may be first by reading the abstracts. Whether I really want to read the whole article or not, whether it's relevant to my research or not, let me first read the abstract. If it's not relevant, I'm not going to bother. So that is something that you need to do. Even experienced researchers feel overwhelmed by information overload. Let me tell you, this is a fact. This is a fact. I have been researching now for the past 20 years, and I find that sometimes I'm overwhelmed with the amount of information out there. Also, I think the problem is that it used to be so much more difficult to access literature before. Now it is so much easier to access literature, which makes the information overload even more problematic, because you have so much of access to information. So you're overloaded with information. Where is it that you stop? So that is a huge question which is there, and we need to be very careful. Let me go a little faster. So you have to ask yourself certain questions. What is the specific thesis, problem, or research question that my literature review helps to define? What type of literature review am I conducting? Am I looking at issues of theory, methodology, policy? So as I told you, you need to look at what type of literature that you're trying to review. Is it to support the broad research questions, your theoretical framework, your methodology, or is it some policy issue that I'm doing and I need to understand what are the policies out there around this journals, books, government documents, popular media, what discipline am I working in? So all these kinds of things you have to ask yourself as you carry out as you begin or as you start your literature review. You need to have some clarity around these, only then you should get into it. In fact, because still a lot of people find doing the kind of network diagram quite problematic. They find it easier to do it on Excel sheets. I quite often tell them that you have one workbook where you put one sheet for a different theme, so that you know what it is that you are looking at, and you put a caption on each sheet, so that you, when you are writing about that, you have got all the literature that's available to you on that one sheet, which you can then carefully synthesize. So and the other question you ask yourself is, how good was my information seeking? Has my search been wide enough to ensure I found all the relevant material? Has it been narrow enough to exclude irrelevant material? Is the number of sources I've used appropriate for the length of my paper? Now, I must tell you this. This was one of the lessons I learned from my supervisor, and I've heard it from a lot of others. So I'd like to tell you this, is that when you're doing research, uh, you may not use certain literature, but it's always good to know about it. So you are kind of saying, or you may make reference to it and say that I understand, I know, I'm aware that there is research regarding all these things, but this is not within the scope of my research. So you are actually limiting, but you are also telling the reader that, look, I'm aware of all this, I have read this, I have seen it. If required, they also know that you can go to all that material. You have a certain understanding of the larger scheme of things. So therefore, it is important to say that sometimes, to explain to others, or to identify yourself, what are the limits of your research, where is it that you are imposing their limits, those limits, because otherwise it can be open-ended and it can be very wide. So you have to sometimes self-impose these kind of limits, and this is one good way of doing it. Then have I critically analyzed the literature I use? So this is one of the things that we always have to do, is we need to constantly look at our literature with a very critical eye. Do I follow through a set of concepts and questions, comparing items to each other in ways that deal with them? Instead of just listing and summarizing items, do I assess them, discussing strengths and weaknesses? So this is one thing that often happens, is that we just summarize things and present it. Now, literature review is not just about summarizing them. In fact, that's why when you start writing a literature, they say the first one or two statements in a paragraph should be your own voice, and the last one or two sentences in a paragraph should again be your own voice. In a way, it summarizes some of the debates there. So that is how most often you need to do things. It should not be that you're just summarizing, but you should critically look at the literature. Have I cited and discussed studies contrary to my perspective? Now, this is a very, very important thing. And this is, again, a part of that positioning. It is partly that either or position that we take, that because we look at it from a certain framework or a certain understanding that we have, we do not want to look at any of the literature which is contrary. Now, for example, we had recently we had our registration seminars, and we had a presentation of, everybody had to present a brief proposal, and there was one person who came and did a proposal which was very good, very good. He was actually quite good, and he was looking at doing a review of some of the tribal development agencies that there are, and that the state government has, and he wants to look at whether the policies of government have actually worked. They've now been going on for say 20 years, 30 years. So he wants to actually do a very, very strong and focused review of 2 tribal development agencies. Now, I could see that he was getting confused somewhere in the middle, while he was very aware of some of the issues, but at one point he was getting a little confused. So I actually had to ask him in the end, saying, like, what is your academic background? And he actually said that he was a science graduate, and then he had done a series of courses, which was starting from management to forestry to climate change to, I don't know, everything under the sun. Anyway, he had done so many programs, it was just amazing, which was really fantastic, because that's what had led him to do this proposal, which was quite a I didn't expect such a good proposal at that early stage. But then I asked him one thing. I said, somewhere along the way you have lost track of some things. So he says, what? So I said, when you say, he kept talking about development, and he kept talking about mainstream. So I said, when you say mainstream, what do you mean by mainstream? Is it that you want them to be like us? Is that what you're trying to say? When you say development, what do you mean by it? So, and then I had to tell him that there's so much of literature which from the what is called the post-development literature, which actually has critiqued this whole idea of development. And he needed to look at some of that and present that, because then he would have understood exactly how he should approach this whole idea also. And because he had not looked at it from that perspective, he was giving only one particular view, so it was early days, and he recognized that, and I recognized that. But I thought it was important to, make him aware of that very early on, so that he doesn't fall into the trap right from the start. So I think it is very important to recognize what are the contrary perspectives, and actually make note and present those things also, because also people need to understand that that even if you don't place it within that, you are saying that, yes, I'm aware of that, and knowing that I'm still stating this. So that I think is important to state. And will the reader find my literature review relevant, appropriate, and useful? So this is what you also need to ask yourself. Now, I think some of these things are more detailed into that, so we'll just skip some of these things and we'll go on. There are a lot of questions to be asked about the literature. Now, what to do if you have too many sources? And I think this is what is again a very critical issue. And now I can see that there are a lot of articles, and especially from a lot of publishers, who are talking about fake evidences, about cheating in writing, and all those kinds of things. So we need to be very careful, because quite often we find that people are quoting from some very obscure journal, which probably you don't even have access to, and you don't you will never get. And sometimes you don't even know if they actually exist. So it's important sometimes, the way you do it is to actually scale your search down. And that's very important to a manageable amount. So you come down to, you have specific journals, you take experts' advice, you have a time frame that you say, I will give myself this much time in which to do this. So that's one way of doing it. But I think one of the best thing is to look at specific journals, and you take good, identify some of the good journals, and you'll get this when you start looking at cross citations. You will know which articles you need to refer to, which you don't need to. It will be very clear. It becomes very clear very early on if you only follow some of those rules that we talk about. And it is important that you synthesize information. So where are you, as you go through, sometimes you also reach saturation. You'll find that most of them are saying the same thing. So sometimes then you say, okay, on this area, I have now reached saturation. I'm not finding that there's anything which is coming out which is really new or different. So I'm going to stop with this. So you need to kind of actually set yourself some kind of focus and boundaries as to how you will work with too many sources if you have them. And I think that's very important to do. You have to consider organizing, and how would you do? First, cover the basic topics, and these basic topics, as I said, must contain at least 3 elements: an introduction or background information, the body of the review containing the discussion of sources, arrange the materials in the body rather either chronologically, thematically, or methodologically, and finally a conclusion and a recommendation section. So you need to organize once you start doing your literature review, and once you start writing it down, then you need to know that it has to follow the same rule as you would follow in any essay. It needs to have an introduction, it needs to have a body, and it needs to have a conclusion. So that is one, you must ensure that every topic that you are doing actually covers this. So you may have a chapter where your research comprises of three, four thematic areas. So in each thematic area, which might go as a subheading, you'll have an introduction, you'll have a body, and you'll have a conclusion. So that is what. So you'll have to cover your basic topics in that manner, and you ensure that everything is. And then you start writing. How you will start writing? You start using evidence. You refer to several other sources when making your points. A literature review in this sense is just like any other academic research paper, as I told you. Your interpretation of the available sources must be backed up with evidence to show that what you are saying is valid. So one thing is, your voice must come through. Everything, your voice must come through. It is you who are doing the literature review. So your voice must come through, but your interpretation must be backed up with evidence. So if you say something, then you say, okay, yes, so and so in his or her research also found similar things, or finding was contrary to what I have found. So you are posing both areas. So you are saying that, and you can say why it was contrary. That also you can state, or you can say that why your findings are different. So these are some of the ways you actually use evidence to present your material. Be selective. Select only the most important points in each source to highlight in the review. So it is very important now, like I was saying, some of the tools that you have, the electronic tools, you can actually make notes as you read. So you can say this point is important, or this point is important. So you can highlight those things also. So when you go to that article, you immediately pick up only those 1 or 2 points and you put it into your literature review. You don't have to look at any of the other things that they've said. But as I said, when you put that in as your reference, somebody else who looks at yours will go to your citations, and then will go back and look at those, what else they have to say, which may be relevant to what they are doing. So that is the way you go about it, and that is the way others will go about it. Then use quotes sparingly. This is one thing that we always say, that in literature review, don't use direct quotes, or use them sparingly. Not that you don't use them. Don't use large texts, just small bits and pieces to support what you are saying. That's all. Don't use large amounts of text from something else. Sometimes the survey nature of the literature review does not allow for in-depth discussion or detailed quotes from the text. Some short quotes here and there are okay, though if you want to emphasize a point, or if what the author said just cannot be rewritten in your own words, you may still do it. Or if what the author said, just cannot be written in your own words. So most often what you're doing in a literature review is you're actually paraphrasing what somebody is saying. You are actually letting your voice come through. But sometimes you find that some things an author has said is so, it couldn't have been said better. For example, one of the quotes that I always remember is that in order to first what is that? You must unlearn what you have learned. This is a quote by Edward Said in his very famous book Orientalism. So there are some things which you just cannot find any way of paraphrasing them. So that becomes important then. So, but there will be very small quotes which you actually do. Then summarize and synthesize. Remember to summarize and synthesize your sources within each paragraph as well as throughout the review. So this is the other thing that I was saying, that each paragraph in itself should also have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. And with that, you should always have a link statement to the next paragraph. So that is how that is more of writing. When you write any kind of essay, that is the rule you would follow. But in a literature review also, it is exactly the same. It is exactly the same. So while you have the literature review which follows this order, every paragraph must also have a similar construction. Again, I'm saying that keep your own voice. That becomes very important when you are writing. That when you're presenting others' ideas, your voice should remain front and center. And this is becoming more and more important. One of the questions I get asked very often is it all right to write in the first person? Can I write my thesis entirely in the first person? I did this. I went there. I went and, or you say, no, this is what, the subjects of the research said this, and, this is a researcher did this. So this is the kind of question which I get often asked. And I think it's a question of how you approach it. Often, my personal view is that it's good to use the personal pronoun. There's nothing wrong with it. Your voice is very much heard then. Otherwise, it's like you're trying to escape by hiding behind the researcher. So it is often, it's okay to use your own voice. Then use caution when paraphrasing. When paraphrasing a source that is not your own, be sure to represent the author's information or opinion accurately and in your own words. This is one of the things which happens while we say that you should paraphrase. You should also be careful. One thing is that you're representing the author's views properly, but the other thing is that you're actually paraphrasing. Sometimes it is just like a few changes here and there, and that's all it is. That is not paraphrasing. So you have to be careful that you are, one thing is that you're expressing the views of the author, but the second is that you are actually paraphrasing. So that is again another issue that you have to be careful. You can either directly refer in the text to the author of the source, or provide ample notation in the text when the ideas you are mentioning are not your own. So this is one of the things that you need to do always, is that you there's nothing wrong in paraphrasing, but you always need to reference it. And that is what is again a very important thing, because quite often there is a tendency to just paraphrase and leave it. So when you do a plagiarism test at the end, then you find that it's all there's still a lot of similarity index, and that's when you say, why should you do that? What's the issue if you actually acknowledge the author? There's no problem. You are acknowledging the author, and then you are as has been said, that you are summarizing it in your own words. So that's perfectly all right. So, but people need to recognize that it's important to do that. What are the challenges? Again, how do you condense others' work without distorting it? Do not write everything down. Create your own shortcuts and shorthands. Use numbers for numerical terms. These are just practical hints. Record all vital names, dates, and definitions. This is critical. Now, if you don't do this, what happens is when you come back to it later, you never remember. And that because you've gone through so much of literature that it becomes, if you don't note it down at the right time, you will never find it when you go back to it later. So it's important to follow this. Mark items that need further examination and check accuracy before returning or filing the source. So these are some of the things, the challenges that are there, but which you need to do. Be careful about how you pursue them. Some more challenges: writing and summarizing as you find sources. You have to do this with speed and efficiency. You become familiar with the geography of the source. You locate the points of the argument. So suppose you are looking at a book, where exactly is this, have you taken this from? So you have to either become familiar, otherwise, as I said, you make note of all the like page numbers, all the coordinates, so that anytime you need, you get back to it. Identify key subpoints, identify key themes, skim paragraphs. So one of the way of doing some of these things is highlighting in the, if you're getting a photocopied stuff, you just highlight it, or if you're doing it electronically also, you can highlight things. So some of these things are very useful tools, which I think are very practical tools that you need to do. Well, a final note, again, I tell you, is that a literature review is a piece of discursive prose and not a list describing or summarizing one piece of literature after another. It's usually a bad sign to see every paragraph beginning with the name of a researcher, and people often make this mistake. Every paragraph begins with the name of a researcher, so and so said, and that I think is a big problem. It's not a very good way of doing a literature review. You need to organize the literature review into sections that presents themes or identifies trends and including relevant theory. You're not trying to list all the material published, but to synthesize and evaluate it according to the guiding concepts of your thesis and or your research question. So that is what you're trying to do. So just synthesize the material and evaluate it according to what are your guiding principles. Don't just present it saying, this author said this, this author said this, this author said this. That's not a very good way of doing it. You need to critically look at the literature. So that's what is very important. Now, I just have a brief note on annotated bibliography. So that is actually to say what is the difference. Annotated bibliography is actually a summary of some collection of summaries of articles in which you may put some critical comments at the end of each. So that is the difference between an annotated bibliography and a literature review. Often that they are mixed up, because especially when people are first entering into research, sometimes it is what they are doing is really an annotated bibliography. They're not really doing a literature review. So that is some of the things which is needed to be recognized. Now, these are some illustrations about how to present, and I think that's what I want to show you some examples of both good and not so good. But it's actually not so good, but it is how do you present some of these things. Suppose you are reading an article in which you find that there is a flawed understanding of a phenomena, right? Some phenomenon the person is actually researching, but there is a flawed understanding of that. So how do you actually present it when you are doing your literature review? So this is one example, and this is taken from some literature which exists. So Nice in 2002, somebody who has written about it, contends that foreign creditors would have suffered huge and immediate losses had the IMF not intervened. However, these are naive comments from a member of an organization that promotes the free market approach. Foreign creditors would have known the structure of the financial systems in Southeast Asian countries, and the close links between businesses would have with their respected governments. So this. How do you present this? So there is a flawed understanding there, and the person has actually said that these are naive comments from a member of an organization that promotes the free market approach. So you don't say that oh, this is wrong, but this is a nice way of putting it, but in actually stating that their understanding of the phenomenon is flawed. In other words, they would have been well aware of the risks and did not need protection from the fund. So if somebody is actually if somebody is actually going to foreign creditors, then they would be well aware of the risks. So why would they go? So, or if they would go knowing that there are risks. So this is the kind of thing which how it can be presented. So some of these illustrations are here identifying a particular issue, and I've actually done some illustrations. So now here you are trying to challenge to a statement of fact. So in this article, The Economist is also responsible for portraying the IMF as an organization that had no choice other than to implement the policies it implemented. Since the fund had an enormous range of possible courses of action in response to these events, this portrayal is clearly not true. So this is a challenge to a statement of fact. So when you say that The Economist is also responsible for portraying the IMF as an operation that had no choice, now that is what has been actually the statement which has been made. But in the literature, you say that since the fund had an enormous range of possible courses of action in response to these events, this portrayal is clearly not true. So that is how you actually present some of these things. Now there's a second one here. If you look at this, there appears to be an error or at least a discrepancy when data on waterway freight growth, 9 million tons, is compared with a figure of 12 million tons cited in AINA. Now, if you look at this was done in 2002. They were talking about 9 million tons, whereas in 2001, there was already a figure of 12 million tons. So you are actually refuting a fact which has been presented in the literature. Some article has said 9 million tons, DFRA 2002. So you are refuting that fact, and you are saying as compared to a figure of 12 million tons cited in AINA 2001. So these are clearly some of the things that you are actually doing in the literature review, because you are collecting data from so many sources. So you are actually synthesizing them. You are finding out where there is a problem with actually the facts, where there are problem in actually understanding of a phenomenon, and many such things. Like here now, excessively narrow subject focus. You look at this, only Krippendorf fails to discuss in detail the economic impact, favoring instead a discussion of some of the other effects of tourism. One might argue that the tight concentration by other authors on the purely economic effects may result in unnecessarily narrow, incomplete, and possibly biased conclusions. So it's very clearly saying that a narrow focus on a particular aspect may lead to incomplete and bias in conclusions. So you are presenting what is said and then arguing that this is what might be the case. So some of these things, the reason I gave this is this might help you in the future when you are trying to do literature reviews, or when you are trying to also, maybe you yourselves, some of you might be taking courses like this for others in the future. This will help you in trying to look at some of the literature from some of these aspects. Now, poor data collection methods. Now, you look at this. However, Stanton and Bardoni's 1972 research can be questioned in that whilst they carried out an anonymous questionnaire of enlisted males under 25 years of age in Vietnam, they left the respondent to define flashback for themselves. And I think this is what is very critical, that we don't often ask the right kind of questions. Okay, whether by doing this, a subsequent researcher can then actually compare those findings with their own. That's what they're saying. This personal definition is clearly unsatisfactory and does not enable comparison between studies, nor does it allow for an examination of the nature of such flashback reports. Consequently, a major variable was not controlled for or quantified. And this is one of the problems in most studies which depend on recall. Recall, in this case, it is flashback. Flashback again is a little bigger problem, because you don't know how they are defining flashback, what period are they looking at. This becomes a very big issue. Whereas in recall, if you are doing something like what happened 3 days ago, you can actually spell out what period you are talking about. So there are different things different ways you can approach certain things, which enable, again, it's about defining what is that recall, or defining what is flashback, which is very important to do. Otherwise, left to themselves, methodologically, it can create problems for future comparisons. So this is one of the issues that is being talked of in literature review. Here is another one. This has been actually taken from different literatures, so to highlight where the problems are or how they have been addressed. Horowitz in 1969 interviewed a smaller sample, n equals 31, of individuals said to be representative members of a drug-taking community, and found that 32% reported having flashbacks. However, there was polydrug use amongst this group, which could have confounded the results. Now, I just want to state that this flashback is different from this flashback. They're two different things. So this flashback is actually a response to drug taking. It's not the same thing as that. So, but what they're saying here is that they were talking about a particular drug, but they did not take into account the fact that there were polydrug users, that there were people who were using different types of drugs, so which may have actually messed up the results, because you are not able to attribute whatever your findings is to that particular drug. So therefore, it has confounded the results. So this is what in the literature review somebody has presented. So how methodologically things can go wrong, and how that has been highlighted in a literature review, that this is the methodological flaw that was there. So this has been actually presented here. Now, omission of potentially relevant information. Now, when defining culture as an again, this is a very interesting aspect, because we often do this, especially in the social sciences. When defining culture as an acquired element, the authors omit consideration of an individual's personality and genetic makeup, although both of these factors interact with the culture in which they are brought up to create their observed behavior. So we know, for example, that and there's a lot of literature to suggest that there is a combination of nature and nurture in the observed behavior of a person. So if you take only the defining culture and forget about the personality and genetic makeup, then it gives rise to some skewed results. So instead of saying that, they've said that although both of these factors interact with the culture in which they are brought up to create their observed behavior. So if you are talking about the relationship between culture and observed behavior, and you omit personality and genetic makeup, then you are getting flawed results. So this is some of the ways that it can be presented. Lack of evidence to support conclusions. Again, this is one of the things. The main shortcoming of this text is the author's reliance on personal opinion rather than empirical data. For example, on page 325, there's a critical attack on the government's policy towards private eye hospitals, but the author offers no data to support the argument he is making. So this is one of the things again that we do quite often, is that we make sweeping statements. We don't have any kind of supporting evidence, but we just draw conclusions on the basis of either anecdotes or on certain assumptions. Okay, so this is some of the things that are picked up often in literature reviews, where they say that this is not available, and so this is how it can be then stated. In the absence of any supporting evidence, there is no way of judging the validity or reliability of his conclusions, and this seriously undermines the value of the work. So you can see how nicely it can be presented without actually making some stark statements which are not which are very direct. You can put it across very nicely using the kind of available material. Then lack of current data. This is again one of the things. Recent years have seen the publication of a number of critiques of changes in funding regimes. For example, Anderson 2003, Phillips 2002. However, this text was published before the recent wave of reforms that took place. Consequently, although much of the book's contents remain valuable, the conclusions on this particular aspect of the problem are at best partial in nature and at worst no longer relevant. So you can see that if some, that's why I say it's important to also say that we will take up only say about 10 years of literature, so that this kind of problem doesn't arise, that you don't have current data. And so I think with this I'll just stop, and I'll just ask if there are any questions that I can respond to.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the presentation. Yes, we will quickly move on to the question and answer session, ma'am.
Yes.
We have some questions that have come up.
Yes.
Our first question is, what is the best way of avoiding plagiarism in a literature review?
So the best, the main thing is how the idea of a literature review is not to present literature as it is. We're not saying that the author said this, author said that, and just presenting it the way it is, or paraphrasing it minimally. The best way of doing it is to actually synthesize what you read and present it in your voice. Your voice is important. The other way of avoiding plagiarism is to actually acknowledge the author's contribution. So where you are saying, sometimes often I've seen that people just write text without saying that somebody is, you've got it from somewhere. It sounds as if it's you who has said it. So it is always good to acknowledge. As long as you acknowledge, it will never come up as plagiarized. Please note that. But one of the best way of doing it is to actually paraphrase it. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. And our next question is, what are the effective ways of arranging the literature?
So one of the, actually you start arranging it right from day one. As I said, as you start doing your literature review, you have to start arranging it. And one of the ways to do it is, like I see more and more people who are doing it now, is to do it like a network diagram. So thematically, you say, these are my theme areas that I'm approaching. These are the articles in each of the thematic areas that I'm studying. Now, one of the ways to, if you are not very comfortable with that network diagram, then you can do it in Excel sheets. So you have each article listed out in particular columns, and in the last column, you actually do a brief summary where you are highlighting what are the key points that you may need to refer to later on, or which directly relate to your subject matter. So that is the one way of doing it. That's the best way of, easiest way of doing it. Let me put it that way.
Okay. That's nice. And our next question is, for good research, what will be the minimum number of literature reviews one should go through?
See, there is no prescribed number. Let me tell you, there is no prescribed number that you have to do so many readings or not. As often it is determined by the subject area that you are pursuing. Sometimes there is not much literature in particular subject areas, so you have to rely on very little. And that is one thing. The second thing is sometimes the field is so wide that you have a lot of literature, in which case you usually have to put boundaries on that. How much will I do? So should I do, and usually the best way of doing that is to look at the time frame. So a decade of research in that area that I will look at, and within that also I will say I'll take the top so many. So it might be top 20, top 30. It actually depends on what is the scope of your research. If you have many thematic areas, or you try and keep that also to the minimal. But if you have 2 or 3 thematic areas, then it will end up being quite a lot if you're not careful. So you have to actually put boundaries on some of those things.
Okay. And our next question is, how critical should be the literature review for postgraduate dissertation, as the time limit is less for a master degree as compared to PhD?
See, I think, I don't think criticality can be measured in that way, that, for postgraduate research, it is less, and for PhD research, it is more. No, it is, you may look at less references, and the literature you're reviewing is less in a master's, in a postgraduate research, but that critical element has to be there. Otherwise, what is happening now, I'll tell you, that people are coming through a system. When they are coming to PhD, we are having to actually train them about all these things. Whereas actually some of these things, they should know while they are doing their post-graduation. They should have already got that training, but they have not. So I think that that's not a very good way of working on criticality and critically reviewing literature review. You may say that, look, do a smaller amount of literature, but do it well. That's how you do it. Don't say that, do an exhaustive literature review. No, you don't have to do an exhaustive literature review, but do a good literature review.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, ma'am. And our next question is, can you please explain the difficulties in ELT research?
ELT research are you talking about English language training?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So it depends again on what area, what you're... See, to tell you the truth, I think bulk of the issue is resolved if you define your research question well. If you spend time in reviewing the literature before you determine what is the research you'll get into, a bulk of the issues are resolved. So you really need to go through that process. Now people think that, oh, now I'm entered the PhD program, I have to get my topic, and that is what you should not be doing. You should spend time and go through your research, go through your literature, and then identify what the issues that you want to research. So you actually eliminate some of these issues that you're talking about. And it's not about ELT research. It is about, the same kind of problems can happen with any research. It can happen with scientific research, it can happen with engineering research, and it can happen with social science research. It can happen with literature research. If you don't define the problem, you will remain in a confused state. And that's when the literature review becomes that much more difficult. So you spend time in defining what is the research you will take up. Okay.
Yes,
that's
ma'am.
a very good question, though.
Okay, I hope the participants have received all the answers for your questions. And with this, we come to an end of session 3 and the question and answer session. And thank you, Dr. Supriya ma'am, for joining us today evening in your busy schedule. It was really a very informative session. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the participants who have joined us, those who are watching us live on YouTube as well. Thank you so much. And for tomorrow, we'll be moving on to session 4. And if you're a person watching from YouTube and haven't registered yet, you may register. The registration gates are still open. And we have been getting several questions regarding the certificate download. As I said earlier, log into your IFERP account and you may download the certificates by yourself from the certificates and download section. And still, if you find it difficult, please do write us your queries to webinar@ifrp.in. And thank you, everyone. And for more IFERP events, do follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And thank you so much. The PDF materials have been shared with you. You may download and take them. And I hope we have answered all your questions for the day. And thank you to our academic partners, United Innovators, for joining us at this webinar. And if you're a person who is looking for research article writing, patent filing, or publication, anything related to PhD, you may approach United Innovators. They have amazing services. And we have given the link in the chat. You may join and you may visit their website and you may apply for the services that you're looking for. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Can I would also like to offer, should anybody want to further engage and request me to answer and respond to any more questions, I'm happy to do so. You can gather my email as well from IFERP, and I'm happy to respond.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, and thank you, everyone. Good evening, good day to all. See you tomorrow for session 4. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.